Buenos días a todos en esta sesión número 4 de nuestro curso sobre transiciones urbanas, temas emergentes de, las, eh, de las ciudades. Bueno, algunas instrucciones o recomendaciones previas. Nuestro invitado, Gareth Haysom, del Centro para el Estudio de las Ciudades, Centro Africano para el Estudio de las Ciudades, en Cape Town, va a hacer su presentación sobre el tema de sistemas urbanos alimentarios emergentes y su presentación será en inglés y como la sesión anterior tendremos la posibilidad de escoger el idioma que más nos sentamos cómodos, ya sea en español, en el canal que está en el icono abajo de traducción o de intérprete, o en inglés. Entonces, la mecánica será similar, o igual que el lunes anterior. Gareth nos hará su exposición. Todo esto moderado por la profesora Nora Morales, profesora de la UAM, y quien ella conducirá y moderará toda la sesión. Igual, una exposición de alrededor 35, 40 minutos por nuestro profesor invitado. Después, todas las preguntas y comentarios se pueden hacer en un primer momento en el chat de la plataforma. Nora podrá al final de la exposición del profesor traducirle la pregunta. A veces no podemos presentar todas las preguntas, habrá alguna selección al azar o como vayan llegando, y Nora hará esas preguntas de unos 10, 15 minutos, y después habrá oportunidad de hacer una intervención directa en español o en inglés, como se sientan más cómodos, a nuestro profesor invitado. Entonces, yo le doy la bienvenida y le agradezco mucho a nuestro profesor invitado, a Gareth Haysom, de estar aquí. Muchas gracias, Gareth. Estamos muy contentos sobre un tema muy importante y desde una realidad muy interesante que son las ciudades africanas, en particular Cape Town, Sudáfrica. Podemos aprender mucho. Y bueno, Nora, eres la jefa ahora y te dejamos el control de la sesión. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Salomón, y bienvenido a Gareth. Voy a leer una pequeña semblanza en inglés y pues empezamos contigo. Gareth Haysom, he is an urban geographer based at the African Center of Cities at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. After 15 years working in the food system, he returned to academia in 2007 and started the first postgraduate course in sustainable food systems. He soon realized that cities need far greater attention. He has spent the past 10 years researching, theorizing, and engaging policymakers in issues of urban food systems. Urban food insecurity, urban food governance, and wider urban intersections with the food system. Welcome, Gareth. We are very excited to have you here.
So while I'm sharing my screen, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be speaking, and perhaps worthwhile starting with an apology. I'm sorry I can't present to you in Spanish. I know a few of the African languages, but I'm not particularly well versed in all of them to do a presentation. So thank you to everyone else who's assisting me with translation and everything else here. It's greatly appreciated. So I'm going to use the work that I've done in mostly African cities and other cities around the world to try and use food as a way to understand the urban transitions that are taking place. So a warning up front, I'm not necessarily going to speak just about urban food, but I'm going to try to connect it to multiple different urban systems. And I'm going to reference a number of the projects that I've worked on in order to do that. And so hopefully it all comes together. Just a very brief outline, just to sort of give you a little bit of a roadmap as to where I might be going. I'm going to really just give my own interpretation of what I see as a just urban transition. It is always contested, so we can talk about that later perhaps. And then I'm going to talk of some of the emerging trends around urban food systems, but thinking around how it's been thought about, theorized, but also in terms of practice. Through the presentation, I'll pepper a few kind of cases in there. I apologize up front again for being a little bit biased to Cape Town, but I can speak and answer questions there because it's based on some of my active research. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about sort of future transitions and transformations that are taking place. And I'll wrap it up just using the COVID moment and COVID-19 to show how some of these issues that we're speaking about have come together in cities and how we've noticed that. And really, for us in Cape Town, the connection between the food system and the high levels of very severe cases of COVID-19 and the comorbidities that have come together has meant that many urban managers, policymakers, and even academics have really refocused on the role that cities and food systems play when they combine. So just as a very brief background, and just to allow you to understand where my research comes from, and I don't expect you to read all that very detailed text. That's way too much, but if one wants to look at it later on YouTube, it is there. But really to say we've worked in mostly across Africa in primary and secondary cities. So for us, it's very important to look at context and the specificity of a particular urban space and its regional components and how that might play out. My work has not just been in Africa. I've been very fortunate enough to work with wonderful partners at UAM and elsewhere in Mexico City, but in Kingston, Jamaica, in Bangalore, in Nanjing, in Colombo, and really trying to understand these systems in both the South, but also in Asia, in Latin America, and others. There's lots of work still to be done, but it's this work. And really, I think for me, the main point is to say from here is, if I look at the AFSUN work, we started originally looking at food security in cities and trying to make an argument that food security was an important thing that had to be considered in urban spaces. Our work has since moved to looking at the variations of context, but increasingly it's about trying to understand not food security, but actually understanding the urban system and how the urban system determines the food outcomes of urban residents. And so in nutrition work, we often hear that we need to educate people to have healthy diets. They need to be more active and etc. But we're arguing, and really what's emerging in our work in cities of the South is that it's actually the connections between transport, between work, between the health system, between sort of water and sanitation. All these things come together to determine the health outcomes. And the food system and the urban system connect in ways that are really complex. And I'll speak to some of that going through. So really for me, the important part of this, and I borrow from an old colleague of mine, Mark Swilling, to really argue that whilst Rio Summit in 1992 and others started to introduce the idea, and Brundtland in the 80s introduced the concept of sustainable development and sustainability, it was really only in 2015 when we started the Sustainable Development Goals that we really started to kind of engage in what he calls the sustainability age, and I would agree with that. And it was this time of crisis and transition. And so theme crisis and transition will come through my talk a little bit. But that the ideas of sustainability are contested, as well as what the future might be is contested. And so how do we then think of a sustainable future in amidst these contestations, and how do we deal with them? But really the one thing that I don't think is contested is that continuing with the industrial modernity as we understand it now, given these sustainability challenges, are not going to provide the future that we desire and will not enable us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or a just transition in a far more broader sense in that sense. So how do we understand the issues of resource depletion and a whole set of issues in this transition. And as you'll see when I talk a little bit later, I'll try and map that out and what that meant in the global north and what that might mean in the global south, and why this idea of sustainability might be contested, not to say one's right or wrong, but how do the different regions respond to these sustainability challenges, and what does food let us see and understand from that. So building on this idea of transitions, and I think you heard a bit about the health transition and some of those last week with Vikram and others, there are a number of transitions that are coming together and converging. And when these transitions come together, and again, this is also borrowing from the work of Mark Swilling and others, when they come together, they reinforce one another to almost increase the challenges and the urgency. And so we have ideas around the resource transition, and I know one of the courses in this collection is on mobility and things, but looking at things like peak oil and whatever that might be, but also looking at things like peak phosphorus and a number of scarce resources that are becoming increasingly more scarce. Copper, no new copper finds have been discovered and the quality is declining. So all these resources that aid development, facilitated the development of the global north, are now reaching their limits. And what does that mean in that transition? Ecosystems are starting to buckle. We're starting to see the wildfires. We're starting to see depletions, extinctions, etc. And the new WWF report that came out just last week demonstrates that in profound ways. Carlito Perez, the Chilean economist who wrote about the sort of economic transitions and built on the work from Nikolai Kondratiev, the Russian economist, speaks of these sort of various different periods, these ages that we go through, from steam to industry to petrochemicals, etc. And I think following the 2007-2008 economic crisis, we're at the end of one kind of perhaps the information transition, and we don't know what the new transition is that's emerging out of that. It might be, you know, the information age, it might be others, but we don't know, high tech, etc., but what that might mean. The climate crisis is there. We've just seen this with the cyclones, the flooding, the fires, etc. And then across Africa and other places of the global south, we're also seeing a youth bulge. So this fact that the population is predominantly under the age of 35 in much of the global south, and what that means for how multiple kind of urban aspects are used and consumed. But I want to speak to 4 other transitions and how they intersect. The food system transition, and so how the food system is changing. Obviously the urban transition in the context of this talk, but the nutrition transition, which is a discussion and a view that has emerged from Popkin and others around how when people move to cities, their diets change, they start to eat more meat, less grains, etc. And I want to tease that out a little bit and think a little bit more around that and what that means. But as we've seen now with COVID, the epidemiological crisis, and what that also might mean for health in cities. This is perhaps obvious, but it's just to really highlight the fact that we are moved around, 2007, I think we were 50% urban and 50% rural. Just taking the time, when I pulled this figure, it was sort of 55 to 45%. But really the point of this slide is to show that by 2030, we're going to be almost 70% urban. And so where is that urbanization taking place? And what is driving that urbanization? And what are their resource needs? What are their food needs? What are those needs that need to be supplied to those spaces? And what compromises are being made and what trade-offs have to be made? And this presents a really interesting challenge. But for me, where it's most relevant is here. And so my colleague Edgar Peterson likes to argue, and others, that we had the first urban transition that took 200 years for us to receive kind of urbanized to a point where 500 million people lived in cities. So from 1750 to 1950. Colonialism, mass exploitation, the plundering of many societies, etc., in order to feed the industrialization and the urbanization that took place and the wealth creation in the north. From 1950 to 2030, in a period of 80 years, we're going to see nearly 4 billion people living in cities, and knew that's what the transition has been. That 4 billion all requires access to resources, infrastructure, etc. It can't take place in the way that it took place in the global north. And so the carbon neutrality that is required, the economics that is required, the scale and the need from a social point of view is profound. And there is no roadmap. There's no way to understand that. And so this transition is one of, as Mark Swilling said, crisis and transition. It's this constant way in which we're redesigning things. I've heard it argued, it's almost like flying the airplane while building it. And this is how urbanization is taking place. And what do we use what are our informants and how do we drive that? And so again, really to say that this is a really interesting time to be studying cities, and a really interesting time to understand cities across the world, the differences, etc. Others are writing on this, so I won't go into this much more. I don't want to take up too much time around this talk, but there's some great resources. Unfortunately, only the English versions of that, but hopefully for some interest if one is interested. To come to the food, and really to speak to the food system transition, more interestingly, the sort of more political economy of this, and to speak to what Harriet Friedman and Philip McMichael spoke about, is the food regime thesis, where they argue that during the sort of colonial period, the first food regime was around extraction. And this was really built on the politics of empire and how empire functioned. Distinct injustices taking place, and really very much about racial inequalities, privileging one society at the expense of another. Following the sort of period into the 1900s, and as industrialization started to take place and the role of the state in building large industrial and investing in these industrial systems, the second food regime started to take place around the interventions of science, the Haber-Bosch process, and all these processes that led the sort of industrialization of maize and other crops globally, where the organizer of this was the state, through subsidies, through the systems, through funding infrastructure like rail, siloing, etc., to drive that and enable food access. But in the neoliberal era, the state withdrew, and we start to see the emergence of the market and private capital determining how that might function and what that might look like. And so who is determining the rules of the game today? People in government might think it's the state, but in many ways, and if anyone reads anything on the food system transitions and the role of big food, the role of the sweet and beverage companies, etc., they'll clearly see it's the market that's driving that. And so what is really interesting for me, when you overlay this with the urbanization trend, you start to see how these two come together in interesting ways. I had this in one of the earlier videos, but just to reiterate it, that often the food system is understood from going from the farm to a consumer, and seen as this linear progression. I'd like to say it does happen that way, but there are far many other things in. There's the ecology, the ecosystems, there's policies and governance that play out, there's technology, there's laws, there's high science, there's all these various different kind of foods that emerge from that, but it also goes through to waste. And these are deeply complex, and if anyone's interested in the study of complex adaptive systems, this is a great way to look at that as well. But also, there are many actors in the system. There are also winners and losers through that. And again, the food system, I would argue, is still deeply racially prejudicial in that sense. And emerging in this is discourses around justice, the food sovereignty movement and others, but also significant negative outcomes that are coming from that food system. The last sort of big scheme is to also argue how the food system is understood from policymakers. And Solomon mentioned that I engage policymakers on this, and Prof. Morales. But after the famines of the 1960s and early 1970s, the United Nations tried to understand what food security meant. And the 1975 conference really spoke on ensuring availability of food at all times. Amartya Sen, the Indian economist based at Cambridge, studied the Bengal famines and said that whilst in the famines, there was a lot of food available, but people couldn't access that food. And really emerged from that in the 1980s is this idea of the entitlements theory, that it's not just around what's available, but how accessible that food is. And so that caused a bit of rupture in the FAO. And so from 1996 through to 2001, what emerged in that period was this idea that the food security was around the combination of 4 dimensions: that availability of food, but also how that food was accessed, the quality of food, how that food was prepared, the nutrient values, so the utilization component, but also the stability of that system. So those 4 pillars of availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability has really been the sort of way in which food security and a beneficial food system and a just food system has been understood for the last 20 years. Just recently, some colleagues of ours who were contributing to the high-level panel of experts at the FAO took that definition and said that what is needed is a far more longer-term view than just short-term stability, and so added the sustainability dimension to that definition, but also said that a critical part of this is around voice and around the politics in the food system, and so agency as another component to that. So we now have these 6 pillars with sustainability and agency being added. The reason I go into this is it does speak to how society is mobilizing around the food system, particularly at the urban scale, but it also shows how policymakers in many areas are missing this. So the imagination of many is that we have this transition to a system that looks at the wider system from just production, but in reality, for many policymakers, it's still about availability. And they still think of that, certainly in my context that I work in South Africa and through Southern Africa, it's all about making sure there's enough food grown. So we see even in policymakers globally around growing more food, around urban agriculture or whatever it might be. And this lets urban managers and many policymakers off the hook because they need to understand how these systems all come together. So when we just focus in on the projects of growing enough food, we miss a whole set of other factors that engage politics and society in very different ways. So there's some of these trends that are taking place in the food system. So big food and big science are there. I don't think we're going to get rid of them anytime quickly, although some are arguing that COVID has shown how problematic they have been in the system. But there are a number of other trends taking place. One is the city regional focus, where people are starting to understand the broader region around the city and argue that. Julio Berdiger from the FAO in charge of Latin America makes a really interesting point that about 70% to 80% of people already live in sort of cities, secondary cities and villages. And so arguing that the food system is already mostly urban, and how do we think of these regions and focus on all of those? We have a discourse, mostly from the north, around food deserts and how it places supermarkets in that space, saying when there are only corner shops selling fried foods and highly processed goods in communities, and the absence of supermarkets that enable the access to affordable fresh produce, we start to see problematic dietary results in society. There is really interesting shifts taking place around governance and how governance plays out and what that might mean, and how people are starting to think and come together around the food system. But this focus on urban, and one of the focuses is on moving from the household to the entire city, and I'll talk to that just now. The other area of interest is this nutrition transition and understanding how diets are changing. And for many of these, including the sort of negative nutritional outcomes that come as a result, we're starting to see very interesting things being argued in the global south. So in the context of food deserts, we're arguing that the food deserts might not be the case in the global south, where we have a dynamic and active informal economy. So the work that WeGo does and other groups looking at the informal economy, when they're active in that space, it doesn't mean that you have to have supermarkets coming in to provide fresh food. When there are these sellers selling fruit and vegetable on street corners, embedded within communities, those are really useful places. Where you don't have a powerful civil society and oppressive governments, can you have very interesting sort of community-led food governance processes playing out? When you have a history where people have been subjected to very poor diets, is the nutrition transition as a result of their own laziness in cities, the changes in eating more meat, or is that just something connected more to the urban system? And how can you argue for sort of changes in diet when the wider systems don't allow that? So when mothers who are lactating have to travel for many distances in taxis where their workplaces provide no space for them to express breast milk and things like that, they're going to stop breastfeeding very quickly after returning to work, rather than allowing the 6 months exclusionary breastfeeding and that real boost that those young children get in that first few thousand days of their life. And so how do these systems get reinterrogated? And are they all individual systems, or do they all connect? So maybe just to pause a little bit and reflect that when we speak of the food system, this is still this image taken by colleagues of mine this picture was taken in Kenya, in a city there, looking at the food system very much connected to that regional system. So local produce, local foods being sold by women in very informal ways on the street edges, etc. But then you see a South African supermarket chain, and this is the daily delivery schedule, and the yellow lines depict the various different stores and their refrigerated goods orders that are being pre-packed in massive refrigeration units. So we see these, and I'm sure this is much like elsewhere in Latin America. This is a photograph from another small town in Kenya called Kisumu, 500,000 residents. But what we're seeing is very interesting, is that the way in which food is being channeled in, often coming from China and elsewhere, is then being distributed not through the conventional distribution networks, but through motorbikes, etc. And so this particular town, Kisumu, worked with colleagues in West Africa, where the World Bank was trying to fund freeways, and the Engineers Without Borders came in and said, the connections need to just be bike tracks. So very small 1.5 meter wide bike tracks are being built now by Engineers Without Borders to distribute food in the city region, rather than building massive freeways, and how that reduces resource needs and consumption and the carbon footprint, etc., offers very interesting ways of reimagining the food system. But we also see this food system here, and this is from Zambia, where you're seeing fresh produce being sold with ultra-processed produce. And what is driving this? What is creating the sale of these produce? How is this getting into the system? Why is it being consumed? And I'll come to that in a moment. So these 4 images that I've used kind of speak to the diversity of the challenge, speak to a caution against silver bullets, very easy responses, and how that might play out. And so this case is from South Africa, and it really just speaks to the difference and why it's important for me. And if one looks here, we've got the high income earners, middle income, and low income earners. And so what one sees in this bottom component is how almost all of the city is buying from the supermarkets. The low income are really only buying once a month or once a week. The upper incomes are buying more frequently, but the low incomes are buying here. But what is really interesting, if we look at the top 2, so the street hawker and the spaza is really the kiosk or the corner store. It's just a very South African term, where the low incomes are buying at least 5 days a week or once a week. And the same for the street hawkers, etc. So a very different purchasing profile of the low income compared to the high income in these different areas. And so whose food system do we imagine? Whose food system do policymakers design and understand the food system to suit? So in the South African case, when COVID broke and we had lockdown, society was only allowed to buy from supermarkets in the formal system. And so one can see how very quickly the food system used by most low income was completely shut down, and they were excluded from it. But for me, what is most interesting here, and to build to the point that I want to make around these transitions that we see, is what is being bought here are mostly non-perishable goods. The maize, the processed goods, the processed maize, the processed sugar, and cooking flour for wheat flour. what is being bought here is the fresh produce and the milk, the dairy, the things that are being consumed. And what this points to is that the lowest income consumers very often don't expense things like refrigerators and those things from which one can store food. So in many ways, the street becomes the storage area. The street becomes the refrigerator. The street even becomes the kitchen. And when one's living in a shack, a very one-bedroom unit, what do you prioritize and what then can be accessed elsewhere? And how does the market respond? Policymakers don't see this. They want a kind of Eurocentric view of the city and sort of almost Haussmann type avenues, and they don't see the diversity and the resilience that this system provides. And so the work is starting to emerge to try and really challenge that. And I've taken some examples here. So Belo Horizonte was obviously a classic example. It's starting to fall away now as the new regime in Brazil undermines all the food work that has been done in places like Medellin and Bogota. And these are not without their critiques, but they're really interesting in that there was a sort of central focus on food and how food was managed. In the global north, it's a little bit different, where you're starting to see these different governance structures emerging, where members of society with members of the city government are coming together to try and re-engineer and rethink the food system in very different ways, with different levels of focus. This asks interesting questions around democracy, around governance, around this notion of pluralistic governance and what that might mean. But these are emerging trends, and they're really interesting to watch. Again, the question that I asked earlier is, what does this mean in places where you have oppressive regimes, where there isn't a level of democracy, where people can't come together and convene and express their dissatisfaction with a particular system, where the private sector system is privileged over others, and often a very gender-based system, male system, etc., is privileged and doesn't necessarily allow multiple voices and multiple actors. So to think of these as the potential solution, we have to think more deeply about the political economy of a particular city or place in that process. But what is emerging through these processes is taking Sen's work and focusing on the individual and the household and saying we need to start moving and broaden our conceptual understanding of food from the individual to the entire urban scale. And in broadening it, we have to start understanding how food and the food system connects to multiple other urban systems. And this work of these individual groups is starting to think of this. And so what I've done is I've used this graph here. This is taken from the US, and it's from a group called the Community Food Security Coalition. And I looked at 176 members, and I divided it up by scale. And whilst in the US it might be state, I used that just for province, so it would have relevance to the audiences I was presenting to. But a more district, more regional, so 2 or 3 states, 2 or 3 provinces that came together, a district, so a collection of municipalities within a state or province, and then the more local content being the urban space or local cities. And you can see how the area of focus shifts. So the obvious one around farm to table, where more regional and sort of broader provincial focus applies to those aspects, but where you start to see issues of food security, advocacy, health and nutrition, sort of policies, and even data and knowledge, a distinct urban focus. So the urban focus is particularly important in these various different sort of food system and sort of local governance bodies that are emerging in the US. And so that focus remains the same, and I would argue is equally important in the global South. But then what bodies start to focus on that? And what are the things that get attention? And how is attention pulled away from certain things? And how is it focused on things? So just to show how it's not all just focusing on sort of one particular project, there are these multiple areas of focus and multiple scales at which these operate. Other work, and I'm borrowing here from the work of Hatfield, looks at when a city does take charge of the food system, which is the department at which that sits and who focuses on that. And so for me, the obvious is around health, sustainability, and planning, but in places like New York, when Bloomberg was in charge, or others where you have a very powerful mayor with a very distinct politics, you start to see the mayor's office owning that. And so, but for me, for a broader food system discussion, and now with COVID, I think this sort of collection, excuse me, becomes particularly important around sustainability, planning, and health. Why this is important, and again, borrowing from some work in Cape Town, to demonstrate the severity of the situation, the household food insecurity access prevalence divides food security into 4, where the food secure band sits here. What we have here is the poorest going up to the wealthiest income quintiles. And here you can see where nearly 90% of the poorest people in Cape Town are food insecure. About 80%, just under 80% in the sort of second income quintile, and then it slightly starts to improve as one moves along. And I mean, it demonstrates that it's not just the poor who are food insecure, it's a far wider group, excuse me. And so this wider group that are food insecure, they might be able to get by on a regular basis, often through debt or through borrowing food, etc. And when a crisis like COVID hits, it's these second and third income quintiles that fall very far and very fast into hunger. Perhaps even, well, not more alarmingly, but as alarmingly, is the household dietary diversity scale, whereas a figure here out of 12 food groups, a figure of 6 is an indicator of potential undernutrition. You see, again, a large, even 1, 2, and 3 income quintile are all kind of battling and only getting a few food groups, where most of this is made up of tea and coffee, sugar, carbohydrate and flour and things like breads, etc., and maybe some oils and fats. So very little nutrition going through to that. And so what does this mean in this transition to sustainability and a more just transition? The monthly adequate household food provisioning shows out of 12 months that there are about 5 months where the poorest are worrying. Another 3 to 4 months here and even less. Number of months where people don't have adequate access to food. So this is a real struggle that sits and plays out in that. And it's not just around access to food, it's how the cost of food and the cost of energy and the cost of transport and the cost of healthcare and childcare, etc., all come together to inform decisions that a household has to make around food. And so this image for me is also important. This is one of those kiosks, corner shops, spazas, whatever. And so it reinforces this kind of food deserts literature in some ways. But I think it's useful to ask very different questions. There is a refrigerator, but it's selling energy drinks, a little bit of milk and some milk down below. But what we see here is mostly processed goods, goods that don't require refrigeration, that can be stored for an extended period of time, that are almost pre-prepared, a whole set of biscuits, packaged rice, crisps, etc. Or things like maize that can be cooked in 2 or 3 minutes. Up here, sorry, those are nappies, etc. And then these products that are sort of highly flavored. And the question we ask these vendors when they're selling this is, who decides what gets sold? Is it you or the consumers? And they say, well, the consumers tell us and we have to do this, but this is what they want to buy. And it does then start to ask, why are they buying it? Consumers know that they need healthy food, but they're not going to buy anything that will perish or go to waste. And so this is being bought, not because people are lazy or because it's being manipulated. There's perhaps some reason for that, but it's because it makes sense to buy this food when you don't have refrigeration, when you need to pay the lowest amount of money possible to get food. You need a little bit of protein in terms of tinned fish, etc. And so the urban system is determining this, I would argue, more than consumer demand or anything else. And so here I borrow from Wayne Roberts' quote from 20 years ago, that more than any of our biological needs, the choices we make around food influence the shape, style, pulse, smell, look, feel, health, economy, street life, and infrastructure of the city. And that in order to understand cities, we need to look at them through food. And this was Caroline Steele in her book, Hungry City. And that really has informed our work. So how does the city connect to this image? And so This is Nudi's 2-minute noodles, saying good food is what it's translated into in Kiswahili. So why would someone buy this rather than the traditional diet of greens and maize? And imagine a woman who's been selling produce here would probably need to get into a matatu, a taxi, a minibus taxi, probably also then ride on a bicycle taxi or a motorbike taxi to get home. They have to be here to trade at sunset when there is a maximum foot thing. Their gendered roles still expect them to be preparing food when they get home. And so they need to make a very strategic decision around what that food might be and how they'll prepare that food. But also when they get home, there's no guarantee of electricity. There's no guarantee. They probably might even have to light a fire or something like that, or get charcoal burning to get some form of energy to cook their food, or a gas stove. And so that energy and the return that they get, a 2-minute noodle, is significantly more beneficial to the general peace in the household, to get the kids fed, those hungry children, to get them fed, etc. By the time they get home. 2-minute noodles becomes it becomes something that would get serious consideration over and above the traditional foods. It might be mixed with some of those foods, but these decisions are being made, again, around time, around the variability of energy, around the cost of energy, around the urban system and how transport influences that system, and how the nature of their work and livelihoods are influenced by what they might need to do. And all these different things come together to influence what food is being consumed and how that food is eaten in the cities. And so when we speak about a just urban transition in that 80-year period, and as urban areas start to evolve, my colleague Edgar Pieterse has also argued that the infrastructure that will be built in cities in the next 20 years will determine Africa's development trajectory for the next 100 years. And for me, that becomes quite a profound statement. And when you think of these different things that are happening around the food system, and how choices are being made, and how private sector knows how that food system works, and how policy is way behind in understanding these issues, it becomes really important that we reassert the focus on food and think of food as this component within the system, and how food and design can come together in the urban space. And so really, just to start wrapping up, I want to sort of introduce the concept of food-sensitive planning in urban design. And this concept has emerged from places borrowing from water-sensitive planning in Australia and elsewhere. So it has emerged very much out of the global north. But how this translates into cities of the global south become important. And when we mention food-sensitive planning and urban design, it's automatically assumed to be a design approach, a design concept. But it really requires this question of why should we care? And what is the conceptual kind of things? What is our obligation? In many cases, it's the right to food. How do cities adapt that? And how do planners in urban spaces start to think about that? Not just planners, but policymakers as a whole. What is the problem? Is this about not having enough food, or is it about an urban system that doesn't facilitate access to healthy, safe, and nutritious food? And that deep level of analysis that is needed before we start thinking and responding to issues. Who makes these decisions? Who has powers, and how are powers assigned? And I would add a fourth component to this, is how is the budget divided up? So how does that play into how an approach is organized? And then the design component is around moving to the more normative, quantitative aspects of kind of how do we solve this? But this work has to be done beforehand. And this is the role of researchers, academics, our whole group. And I would argue there are 150 PhDs just sitting and trying to understand this across the global south at this point in time. And it's really getting into this, not into the normative responses, which can be in our masters, but really how do we think through these components? And so what we then also have to do is say that idea of sort of planning often assumes a more formal process. How you sort of plan, you service, you construct, and you move to occupancy. But given the intense presence of informality across most cities of the South, we also have to understand that informal occupy first and then move to more kind of formalization. And so how do these two come together? And I don't have all the answers. Again, there's another 150 PhDs in here around how this work starts to think about, as Bayat said, you know, moving from toehold to toehold versus a more formalized policy approach. And how do we encourage policymakers to embrace both of these? How do these new emerging governance systems understand these two? How do both have equal voice? And what does food tell us about those places around the politics of that? And the absence of this is evident in Cape Town. So just very briefly to show you the green dots, you start to see these green dots. These are supermarkets that were there at our time of democratic transition into a free society. The darker the colors are the wealthier the areas. And what you see, because no one was worrying about food in Cape Town, is you start to see how supermarkets kind of worked along the wealthy areas and missed out this, again, feeding the food deserts area. So food sensitive planning asks us to look at around production, sustainability, processing, transporting, health. What this points to is we can't have a minister of food or a designated member of the mayoral council who looks at food. Really, food becomes something that touches every one of these. And in this sort of new transition, food becomes the really interesting transversal factor, and how we have this thing that touches every different ministerial government department, and then what that means. The problem then is who wakes up and worries about it. And I don't have that answer, but it does require some real thinking. And really, just to speak very briefly to agency, I like using Embry and Misha's view that agency is this constant dance between looking back, considering what we have in the present to understand the future. And so this backward looking thing to learn from history. And just a caution for me is I don't think we look far enough back in history. I think we have to go right back to the colonial history to understand how systems were imposed on society and what that has resulted in today before we consider the future and start thinking of that. So for me, what the food system work does and what a lens of food does is allow us to understand place in the context of all these changing dynamics and what they might mean and what they might resemble and what the outcomes might be and the challenges. And they'll be different by city and region. And so COVID has unlocked a whole lot of thinking around this. And the result of the sort of epidemiological transition and how comorbidities increased the mortality rates that we saw came into cities because it was this kind of disease that came in through the wealthy mobile people and then spread from there, impacted a wide range of society. It's asked us to think about very different things and very different governance. So on that point, let me stop. There's a talk on African cities and transformation coming up, which is there if anyone's interested. But just to say thank you, and I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit, but hopefully that was useful and of interest. So let me just escape and say thank you very much to everyone.
Well, thank you so much for this great presentation. Let me see if we have a few questions in the chat. Let me see. Si alguien tiene preguntas, puede escribirla en el chat o también alzar su mano y preguntar. Well, I think people need more time to put a question, but mientras todos escriben su pregunta, I just have a one, it's not a question, it's if you can expand the concept of food deserts. This is something while we wait for other questions there.
So food deserts emerged in sort of as a theory and a way of thinking around food emerged in the global north, primarily in the UK, around a discussion that people with mobility issues, so people who may have had disabilities, etc., weren't able to access food retail in order to get food. And it expanded very quickly to argue that in many cities you have these corner stores that sell pizzas or fried food and things like that, and have mostly crisps and sugared beverages in these corner stores, and there weren't places where fresh fruit and vegetables and fresh produce was available. And in the global north, the way in which that evolved was this idea that supermarkets could provide affordable, safe, nutritious, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, dairy, and those things that would be beneficial, whereas the small retailers were not providing that food. And the food desert literature speaks to this, and it's been argued in many ways. And I think for me, in the global south, we have food deserts, where we have places where there isn't healthy food, but we also have places where there aren't supermarkets, but where there are a lot of informal vendors, mostly women, selling fresh fruit and vegetable on the street edge, etc. And so my argument from a more theoretical point of view, and a Southern theory and a sort of decolonized view, is how we start to understand and seeing these unseen actors that are missed if you apply just the global north thinking of food deserts. How do we make sure that they become evident, and how we see them, and how we include them in how we understand things? And so again, what can the global south ask of the global north in terms of how things are theorized, but what is absent in how the global north might theorize certain things? So this idea of the food desert, yes, I'm sure there are many places where there isn't healthy food and there's unhealthy food, but it doesn't mean that the only places from which you get healthy food are supermarkets and large formal stores, that it's these other areas as well, if that's helpful.
Okay. Okay, thank you. We have some questions now. We have a question from Ganola Capron, and she says, in the Hungry Cities project, you found difference in major cities that you study. How is the relation between food security and those food systems? We can hear you.
Thanks. Thank you, Gunilla, and greetings to you as well. It's been a long time. I think for me, what has been very interesting is that the food systems in the Hungry cities, so maybe just to remind everyone, Mexico City, Kingston, Jamaica, Namibia came in last, Windhoek, but Cape Town, Maputo, Nairobi, Bangalore, and Nanjing. And maybe to speak to Nanjing was, in the Chinese case, there was very little food insecurity. Mexico City also didn't have as high a level of food insecurity as the example I showed you of Cape Town. So we saw very different levels. So it asks interesting questions around how we frame food insecurity in the global south. It's different across all these cities. What was very interesting was the role that the state played in the Nanjing case. So they have a policy called crawling peg. So as the city expands, local government is mandated to provide land for a government subsidized wet market. Now, we've heard a lot about wet markets with COVID, but these are not the wet markets where, you know, animals are being slaughtered and sold. These are highly sanitary facilities that are computer managed, and because people get access to this, their rental is very low. So the food prices are kept very low, and almost all the food being sold there is fresh produce. So this is a city-state or urban government playing a very active role, responding to a national government directive that enables food access. Whether is that the reason for the Chinese city not having such high levels of food insecurity is another question. In the African context, the connection between both the racist apartheid regimes in Namibia and South Africa and the colonial regimes across all four cities directly influenced the food systems as they are today. So the predominance of very processed maize as part of an industrial strategy to create cheap food for low-paid urban wages, often racial low-paid wages, means that for generations we've had food insecurity and bad food system outcomes. And I imagine it might be interesting, we can do work across the other cities. The impact of economic regimes in Kingston wasn't as evident elsewhere, but certainly in Jamaica, the sort of structural adjustment and the role that the World Bank had in creating a very international food system was interesting in that context. So how it opened up the market to so many. The only other thing was in all the cities, there was supermarkets were very active, except in Bangalore. But what we saw in Bangalore was that the supermarket had effectively been leapfrogged. And because it was a tech hub, what one saw is that the tech companies were really setting up sort of global people were placing orders online, and really the food system had moved online. The tech companies were connecting with farmers and setting up distribution hubs. So a very interesting set of changes where there's some comparisons, but some diverse differences. But I think Bangalore, Nanjing, and Mexico City were probably the most food secure, whereas most of the African cities and Kingston, Jamaica had very high levels of food insecurity. So just to answer that one. Thank you, Gunnar.
Very, very well. We have a few questions now. I'm going to the next one that Claudio Ortiz asked, I was wondering if you are familiar with the recent policy of excess of labeling system in Mexico, and what is your opinion of the impact that it might have in food security, health access of nutritional food in cities?
So I have two answers, and forgive me, I'll be a bit personal on this, but I have a child who has a number of allergies, and I have to, when I go with him, I have to carry an adrenaline pen with me. So I focus on the labels all of a sudden before he's only 5. And so I think labeling is critically important to understand the content of what is in the food. And I think it's a way in which we go. I've seen images of the Coca-Cola bottle cans now in Mexico and elsewhere. And we do need to go that route. And we need, for me, what is most interesting, and perhaps Claudia doesn't answer your question directly, is the politics and the way in which the sugar-sweetened beverage, the big food companies, what strategies have they adopted to try and avoid having to be as honest and as transparent as that. And I think that presents some really interesting questions around the sort of politics of food and things. I think for me, it has to be there. I think my challenge, and I think it spans the entire food system, I think for me, the poorest of the poor are going to make decisions despite those labels. But I think a broader, and as societies move towards middle income, middle class societies, those things become critically important, and how they drive that. And I think for me, it's about a far wider level of conscientization around how food is advertised. That breakfast cereal that says it gives you 11 essential vitamins and iron to start your day, you know, and yet it's full of sugar. I think we need to know that it's not what the advertisers say, but there needs to be the balance. So I think it's part of food democracy and about allowing us the information that is necessary to help us make decisions around food as well. So I hope that answers Claudia's question.
We have one raised hand of Salomon, and then I'm trying to package the questions. So Salomon, you can go on. We can hear.
No, Nora, si quieres continúa con las preguntas,
okay.
Y al último ya pasamos a la fase de intervenciones.
Okay, okay. So we are going to continue with the two other questions. We have a lot, but this one refers to how in Mexico City we have incremented the sale in the streets. So all the food that it's not prepared, and it's, as you said, according to certain kind of population. So is this offer should be considered essential for access in food society? That's the main question.
So my view, and again, I can't speak directly, apologies to the Mexico City example, but if I understood the question correctly, is that I think street food is an important part of the city. It's an important part of how cities function. Many cities in the north are trying to re-encourage street food. For me, the question is, what role does city governments play in making, who do we make responsible for ensuring that that food is safe, sanitary, and that the vendors are safe and that they can provide the most highest quality and the best quality food? And my sense is, when a city understands the diversity of the food system, that it's the formal and the street vendors and things, and sure, things need to be planned and placed in certain areas, I think they also have to consider how infrastructure and how services are provided to the multiple actors in the food system. We have the state funding abattoirs